Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, SOCE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, Rural Development, MARD, Revised, Second Year, MRDE-003 Land Reforms and Rural Development, Block-1 Land Tenure Systems and Agrarian Structure, Unit-1 Significance of Land Reforms in Rural Development, 1.0 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to times explain the meaning of land reform, its scope and importance, times understand the need of land reform in rural development, times study the contributions of land reform in rural development, and times identify various issues concerning land reform. 1.1 Introduction. Land reform can be understood by considering the overall rural socio-economic structure of the country. The rural sector in India accounts for a large proportion of the national population, out of which the overwhelming majority is engaged in agriculture and allied occupations. Although a large segment of this sector falls in the low-income category, yet they are a significant source of primary products such as agricultural produce and minerals that are required by the advanced countries also. Considering the significance of this sector in overall nation building, measures have been undertaken by various governments to improve and empower this sector by means of several initiatives of land reforms. Land reform covers various issues. These include theoretical aspects such as meaning and definition of land reforms, its scope, importance in rural development, objectives and approaches to land reforms and major contribution of land reforms in rural development. All these issues will be discussed in this unit. Let us begin by explaining the meaning and definition of land reforms and also the reasons for its need. 1.2 Land reforms, concepts and meaning. Here, we will try to understand the meaning and scope of land reforms, followed by a study of approaches to land reform. 1.2.1 Definition of land reform. There are different land types, methods of farming, history of land acquisition in various countries, and general socio-economic conditions and political objectives of the respective countries that are related to land reforms. Generally, land reform is defined as the redistribution of property or rights in land for the benefit of the landless, tenants and farm laborers. This is a narrow definition, reducing land reform to its simplest element. Wariner, 1969, United Nations in 1951 floated a concept known as land reforms. It defined land reforms as an integrated program with main objective to remove the barriers for economic and social development that emerged from deficiencies in the land tenure. Important features of land reform programs were mentioned as following: 1. Elimination of the traditional economic political exploitative power structure in rural society at large. 2. Redistribution of surplus agricultural land which would lead to more extensive utilization of factors of production, especially land and labor. 3. More rapid adoption of innovative technology and thereby increasing production and productivity. 4. Strengthening of motivation of the peasants for work and readiness to invest in agriculture. It is observed that the terms land reform and agrarian reform are often used interchangeably. Agrarian reform is a word derived from the Cold War period to counter radical movements, whereas land reform involves improvements towards land tenure and institutions related to agriculture. It urges the Rural and Development Administration to go beyond land redistribution, i.e., supporting other rural development measures, such as the improvement of farm credit, cooperatives for farm input supply and marketing, and extension services to facilitate the productive use of the land reallocated. Thus, land reform pertains to the restructuring of tenure rights and the redistribution of land in directions consistent with the socio-political environment of the country. Those favoring revolutionary change advocate a drastic, planned, public intervention pertaining to the redistribution of land, yet attempts at drastic redistribution of private land in the face of strong opposition from landed interests, and in some cases related budgetary impediments, may distract from more feasible evolutionary policies aimed at improving access and security of tenure for small farmers under alternative forms of individual and communal tenure which do not involve expropriation and compensation. 1.2.2 Approaches to land reform. There are different approaches towards studying land reform in context of varied level of success in terms of coverage and impact on productivity and income. These approaches could be studied under the following heads: Asia and the Middle East, land for the tiller. In the restructuring, which followed World War II, a major objective of land reform was to break up feudal estates and prevent the advancement of communist revolution. Reforms in East Asia have been comprehensive, creating a class of independent property-owning peasants and alleviating poverty and landlessness. However, the contexts have been highly specific, thereby limiting replicability. Hayami et al., 1990. Thus, in Japan, land reform was enforced by U.S. occupation forces as a means of breaking the power of large landowners who contributed the pillars of the militaristic class. Resident landlords were entitled to retain only about 1 hectare. The reform in Korea was carried out under the threat of communist aggression from the north of the country. In Taiwan, land reform was imposed by the nationalist government exiled from mainland China and therefore alienated from indigenous landowners. Also important for success in Taiwan were absence of accurate land tenure data and the dominant non-indigenous bureaucracy that had accompanied Chiang Kai-shek. In East Asia, land reform usually entailed the transfer of rights to tenants without breaking up operational holdings. Reforms covering landlord tenancies in the Middle East, example, Iran, Egypt and Iraq, and India, example, in Kerala, followed a similar pattern. However, except for Egypt under Nasser, they were less effective due to stiff opposition from influential landowners. Attempts to implement land for the tiller reforms in the Philippines met with mixed results for the same reasons. Latin America, redistribution of estates. Unlike Europe and Asia, where there has been a broad tradition of small farm ownership, in Latin America the monopoly of land ownership stemmed from colonial rule, either from the subjection of the indigenous population or from the use of imported slaves on plantations. From 1910 to 1990, Latin American countries attempted an enormous variety of land reforms. Redistributive reforms in Mexico, Bolivia and Chile focused on the transformation of semi-feudal estates, haciendas, based on bonded labor, corvée labor and labor tenants, into capitalist estates employing wage labor, landowning family farms and free peasant farms. Cuba collectivized all large plantations, a process which is now being relaxed in favor of cooperatives. Towards the end of these periods, agrarian reforms were often complemented by labor laws. Some abolished sharecropping and share tenancies, pursuing a land for the tiller approach of land reform. As is often the case, landowners anticipated the new laws and took preemptive steps like evicting the tenants and dismissing labor. To skeptics, these reforms therefore merely served to modernize labor contracts rather than redistribute land. On the other hand, detailed production data collected in Chile in the period 1965 to 70 on land reform settlements formed from expropriated land as well as on portions retained by landowners, showed significant increases in output per hectare. Africa, redistribution of white-owned land. Land reforms in African countries have been concerned with correcting the imbalance of agricultural land ownership by the minority white settler population, which controlled about 50% of the agricultural land in both Namibia and Zimbabwe, and over 80% in South Africa at the transfer of power to the native majority. In Zimbabwe, 15 years after the Lancaster House Agreement, and in South Africa, where the situation is more complex, the restitution of land theft remains a burning issue. However, if Kenya's experience is any guide, redistribution of white-owned lands can distract governments from resolving major problems of land rights in the former African reserves. This appears also to be the case in Namibia. Proposed reforms in South Africa are, however, sensitive to this issue. Decollectivization in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, although followed by collectivization, land reform in Russia initially took place because of peasant mobilization against the landlords. It is difficult to argue that current developments fall into our definition of land reform. For example, the decision to restore the rights of former owners has been universal in the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These may or may not be landless tenants and farm laborers. In the former communist bloc, land reform has a mixture of objectives, economic efficiency, and the need to move to a market economy to raise revenue from private property, the restitution of rights to former owners that were expropriated by the state, and social justice for farm workers. Nevertheless, the problems of land redistribution in former communist states have much in common with classical land reform programs, even to the extent that they are opposed by the former landholding elites in the state bureaucracy. A major advantage that they enjoy is that the cost of land acquisition for the state is minimal. 1.2.3 Interventions in land reform. There are four main types of interventions in land reform, namely land tenure reform, external inducements, external controls, and conformation of title. Land tenure reform, it is designed to adjust or correct the reciprocal property rights between proprietors in response to changing economic needs. Example, the establishment of statutory committees or land boards to organize and supervise the use of common rights and other interests, the conversion of more informal tenancy into formal property rights, tenancy reform to adjust the terms of contract between landlord and tenant. External inducements, these are market-based incentives offered by government for social and economic reasons and leading to the restructuring of existing property rights or the creation of new ones. Example, the distribution of public lands, state expenditure on land reclamation and subsequent allotment as private property, state-sponsored credits channeled by a land bank through cooperatives, support to institutions to administer the necessary land acquisition and distribution mechanisms. External controls, these include prohibitions imposed by law on property rights, i.e., non-market measures, for instance, nationalization and collectivization, restitution, redistribution policies involving expropriation of land, with or without compensation, on grounds of excessive size, underutilization, ownership by absentee landlords and/or foreigners. By contrast, gradual redistribution policies operate, example, through death duties. Other external controls can also act against redistribution, example, laws preventing land fragmentation below certain minima, conformation of title. This is aimed to verify and secure land titles to those who have already a demonstrable claim. It reduces doubt and contention and lays the foundations for land reform towards rural development. 1.2.4 Dimensions of land reforms. The dimensions of land reform can be studied under two major categories. The first one pertains to optimal redistribution of land to small agriculture producers, and second one is related to institutional adjustments to formulate a structured land tenure policy. Redistributional land reform. The redistributional land reform aims to minimize accumulation of land holding with a particular group or social institution. It refers to transfer of land assets from one group, either the state or more often large private landowners, to either landless or small producers. It is seen that despite immense economic and administrative investments in this kind of land reform, it has failed repeatedly to attain its objectives. Vast distributional inequities of land still exist where distorted markets continue to conspire against small agriculturists and rural areas are still poverty-ridden. The redistributive land reform is based on two sets of beliefs. Firstly, it can lead to direct equity gains, and secondly, can clear productivity improvements. These provide greater security, more employment, and results in income improvement. These in turn contribute towards better farm credit and improvement in national food security. B. Institutional land reform. It focuses on the various areas of institutional support to land reform, identifying several important areas of assistance that possess the potential to improve agricultural yield and economic value for both the government and the rural poor.
1.2.5 Scope of land reform. The scope of land reform can be studied with reference to the following: A. Redistribution of land. B. Revision of land ceiling limit. C. Systemic restructuring of land involving optimal use of energy and water. D. Enable the small farmers to improve agricultural productivity of their land. 1.3 Need for land reform. The need for land reform is felt due to the following reasons. A. It is an instrument of both direct and indirect poverty reduction. B. It results in greater agricultural asset ownership and improved income for small farmers. C. It increases employment opportunities in the agricultural sector. D. It ensures security and increased access to farm credit for small rural producers. E. It enhances agricultural incomes leading to increased demand for tradable commodities and manufactured goods, stemming from both expanded agricultural potential and a general increase in consumer demand. F. It sponsors greater household and national food security. G. It protects and strengthens the rights of indigenous small farmer groups. H. It strengthens the rights and well-being of women agricultural labor, leading to greater gender equity. I. It provides direct support to vulnerable groups, including the old, the youth and those affected by physical and mental disabilities. J. It encourages the conservation and management of ecological balance, thus preventing encroachment on common property resources such as forests and pastures. K. It reduces migration of rural unemployed segment of the population to urban areas. 1.4 Importance of land reforms in rural development. The growing importance of land reform is supported by the following points. A. Enhanced agricultural asset. Since land is one of the principal assets of individual and household wealth, land reform measures leads to increased assets. B. Distributive inequity. Land ownership is often socially uneven, i.e., some social segments possess large land holdings whereas others are left with either very small strips of land or no land at all. Land reform aims at judicious distribution of land and promote equity. C. Distribution and poverty. Unequal land distribution pattern is one of the principal causes of poverty in developing nations, leading to large extent of people living below poverty line. Land reform measures corrects these inequalities by improving the per capita income. D. Productivity. Better managed and organized land distribution coupled with contemporary agricultural production supplements yields Higher land and capital productivity, income. The above benefits result in higher net income streams from agriculture as compared with other possible forms of economic activity. For the rural poor, 1.5 major contributions of land reforms. The major contributions of land reforms can be divided into following 5 areas. A. Promotion of socio-economic equality in the rural population. B. Land reforms influence the basis of economic and political power in rural areas. C. Increasing income and improving the quality of life of rural population. An improvement in the living conditions of the rural population can be achieved primarily by increasing agricultural production. Land management reform measures in particular work as an incentive for production enhancement, which in turn has a considerable effect on income. The feeling of security and the resulting willingness to work harder also increases production and income. When tenants are made landowners, it saves them from paying rent and necessitates taking over the services and obligations that were previously carried out by the landlords. Furthermore, changes in distribution pattern mean generally only the redistribution of chances that cannot be of really much help until there has been increase in production. D. Employment generation. Land reform measures results in increase in employment opportunities. The small size of the farms is generally accompanied by intensification in cropping and animal husbandry, by increase in the input of labor, especially manual labor. The rise in purchasing power of people results in an increase in trade, transportation, and services, which decreases unemployment. Breaking up large farms can, however, result in unemployment of farm workers. Likewise, tenants may lose their land if the owners start cultivating the remaining land they are allowed to keep, particularly if mechanization is introduced or increased at the same time. The laid-off workers and tenants may, however, find employment in other fields like tractor drivers, pump attendants, etc. Positive consequences for agriculture production. Production is directly influenced by measures for improving land management. It is indirectly influenced by incentives affecting work performance and investments that ensue from land ownership reform. The new farmers, because of land reforms, have reason to work hard, and the large landowners try to make up for loss of land by intensive cultivation of the remaining land at their disposal. This will be more successful and more intensive if the proper help is given by means of the necessary services. The higher the level of development, the easier is this outcome, and larger increases in production is possible. The effects of the land reforms on the type of production are generally clearer. The transition from large to small farms leads to a tendency to increase the planting of crops that guarantee self-sufficiency, animal husbandry, multi-crop farming instead of one-crop farming, and forming of annual crops instead of perennial crops. The new farmers are also likely to have improved consumption capacity. Appropriate measure for promoting land management makes it possible to avoid decrease in the share designated for the market and setbacks in the cultivation of export crops. Changes in rural investment capital generation is of great importance for the agricultural sector due to its long-term effects on production and also for the overall economy because of the boost for investments that finally further the economic development. The land reforms lead to a shift in the methods of capital formation. As small farms pay few taxes, because they are exempted as the larger share needed for their subsistence is not counted and only a small percentage of the products are subject to sales and export taxes. On the other hand, the chances of non-monetary capital formation increase. On the part of small farmers, it is possible to take considerable increases in capital stock over the years by investing labor on small improvements on the farms. However, this is generally found only at the level of the individual farmers, whereas the organizational problems exist at the village level. Reforms aiming at collectivization have better chances of succeeding in forming capital by means of investing labor even at a higher level than the small level farmers. 1.6 Issues in land reforms. Major issues related to land reform that needs to be given due attention are a. Enhanced agricultural production and food security. The chronic shortage of food in South Asia not only brought misery to many people, but was also considerably detrimental to the development process on account of import requirements and the resulting dependencies. Even though India has solved her most crucial problems after good harvests and technological changes which took place with Green Revolution, one should be aware that the supply situation is still unstable. One or two insufficient rainfalls during the monsoon can still change the picture.
Hence, effective land reforms measures coupled with technological advances in agriculture must be implemented for ensuring good agriculture yield and national food security. B. Optimal utilization of rural workforce. The increased production of agriculture may be able to match demand of food for the huge population of a developing society but is not sufficient to provide food security. It brings food into the market but not into the houses of the poor people, who may not have money to buy food. To a large extent, their poverty is the result of the lack of job opportunities to provide income and purchasing power. Because of the greater employment generation in agriculture sector, it is possible to find employment, but they may not reach the needy. It is true that there are limits in this sector. First and foremost, institutional factors prevent more labor from being employed in agriculture. The same applies to opportunities for employing people who are not needed in agricultural production to work for developing the urban infrastructure. Even in the case of lack of funds for employment generation in agriculture, food for work can be a good option for employment. C. Socioeconomic equality amongst rural population. The present unequal distribution of economic and political power is not only responsible for the unbalanced participation of the population in development until now, but for widening the gap between the poor and the rich in the rural areas. This process leads to a polarization of the social groups, which annihilates the prospects of cooperation for economic and social development. More equality would possibly create the political climate for incentives to increase production and employment, which can be achieved and maintained. The factors of agricultural production, such as employment of labor and equality, are strongly conditioned by the agrarian structure. The agrarian structure and the changes made in it will determine whether and how far development will achieve the objective of the benefit of the whole rural population. Even after considerable redistribution of land, especially in India, other steps need to be taken. More emphasis is needed on the real redistribution of landed property. There are no appropriate farm sizes for all agricultural functions. The distribution of the power of disposition over means of production of whatever kind and the severance of landed property from economic and political power are more significant than land redistribution in the old style. Increasing agricultural productivity, at first regarding area, and then labor, will steadily become more important than land redistribution. This will raise the question of the social organization in agriculture and of the organization of the farm units. The agrarian organization which is required is one which encourages a combination of production factors, which is compatible with their availability and with the costs, creates incentives for productive labor performance, capital formation, and investments for all the members of the rural society. To create the preconditions for this is the major task for the agrarian structure and agrarian reform policy. This includes access to the necessary services for everyone so that everybody can contribute towards the objective of increasing production. Organization of agriculture, which allows an increased labor input, can also include the integration of animal husbandry on the farms and, thereby, simultaneously improve both income and food. One can imagine that forms of joint land management and animal husbandry could bring new aspects, especially for the employment of labor. D. Genuine political commitment and the administrative foresight. Land reforms have faltered at many places because they were opportunistically conceived in order to mobilize support at a critical time in the process of governance or an aspiring government. Because of the difficulty of sustaining support for redistributive reform, a short sharp shock treatment may be necessary for success. This assumes that the treatment that has been carefully prescribed is simple to administer, adequately communicated, reasonably free from loopholes. It needs to be administered by a bureaucracy that is adequately prepared to keep in view per household costs of land acquisition and settlement that are financially feasible and replicable, and proper monitoring of the progress with land transfer. E. Inadequate administrative capacity for land reform. A large, widely deployed cadre of well-trained field staff is essential to inform the people of their entitlements and to facilitate the legal processes of land acquisition and distribution. The number of staff involved vary with the type of reform. In Philippines, a tripartite partnership between government, the NGOs and the people's organizations has provided many of the field staff. Even quasi-market measures have high transaction costs. A related issue is that of adequate land valuation, survey and public land tenure records. In areas where these do not exist, or have been destroyed, landowners can easily frustrate the process of land acquisition. F. Access to land, water, and other resources, for the countries in which it is necessary to redistribute landed property, maximum ceilings for land fixed by law is suggested. During the process of distribution of land, the weakest groups of the population should be taken into consideration in particular, and cooperatives should be established so that the desired improvements in productivity actually occur. G. Regulation of control and management of forest land, waste land, and water. This is to be done in such a way that the public interest and especially environmental protection are upheld, while, at the same time, the legitimate interests of the local communities are taken into consideration. The population should be made aware of the danger of erosion and informed about the ways and means of its control also. H. Adequate utilization of barren land. This kind of land should be used to settle people who are looking for land. Provision of proper infrastructure and extension services by the governments will ensure the permanence of such measures. Settlement projects should thus be regarded as a supplement to, and not a substitute for, the measures of agrarian reform. In some countries, there is considerable inequality among the various regions. The governments should help level out the differences between poor and rich, as well as between the regions with a good and a proper infrastructure by means of proper and adequate investment programs. It is also important that development programs be drawn up for integrating towns and their rural environment. I. Participation of the population. Rural development can only be achieved by the motivation, participation, and organization of the rural population at every level. As a foundation for effective participation, the governments should remove obstacles which stand in the way of the rural population in freely joining and organizing groups of their choice. In particular, they should promote and support the creation of farmers and workers associations and cooperatives at local, regional, and national levels. The rural population should have the opportunity to participate in development institutions and take part in deciding, implementing, and evaluating development projects, especially those concerned with rural employment. Various social, economic, and cultural service institutions need financial support and training for their functionaries, and it should be done without interference in their autonomy. The young people should be especially mobilized for rural development activities. J. Decentralization of decision-making process, in order to ensure that the rural population make a contribution to the development programs at the planning and implementation stages and provide a regional perspective. It is necessary to decentralize the decision-making process. One of the most important tasks of the local government authorities is to educate and train disadvantaged groups so that they can have a greater share in the life of the community and in the development process. In the wake of land reforms, cooperatives of the new farmers should be funded, which should supervise the observance of the tenancy regulations, especially about allocation of land and water rights. Loans and inputs should also be controlled by organizations of the small farmers and beneficiaries of the reforms. K. Women empowerment in rural development. Women must be fully integrated and given opportunity of acquiring knowledge and skills, and thus ensure their upliftment and empowerment. The government should also remove the legally based discrimination of women in inheritance rights, give them equal access to land, livestock, and in other means of production, make it possible for them to participate in business activities, and guarantee them a right to membership and voting in labor organizations, credit associations, and other similar organizations. The number of women in training and extension programs should be increased, especially in positions from which they have been excluded. Until now, the contents and subjects of training and extension programs should be expanded so that the role of women in production, processing, and marketing can also be considered. To achieve equal participation in public institutions, the women's operative activities should be promoted. To achieve this goal, it will be necessary to create a system to remove the obstacles hindering the participation of women in schools, health services, employment, and development programs. In general, training facilities of equal quality for girls and women should be established and made attractive by offering scholarships. These institutions should be followed up by possibilities of earning an income with the guarantee of an equal salary for equal work. Training possibilities for women are especially important not only in the fields of agriculture and in non-agricultural gainful employment, but also in the sectors like health, nutrition, children's education, and family planning. It is necessary to make sure that, during the transition from a traditional economy to the modern technologies, the negative implications for women are minimized. L. Making the essential inputs, markets, and services accessible. Rural development is hindered by the insufficient availability and utilization of inputs. It is observed that only specific groups of farmers employ modern and yield increasing technologies. By affecting the price policies and by providing other incentives, the governments should encourage the small farms to increase the utilization of inputs. To that end, local institutions have to be established and all of the farms and local groups should have equal access so that they can participate in all their activities. It is of crucial importance that the capital goods are available at the appropriate time to make the input package available. Technological and economic research. The scientific and technological research should be coordinated with social science studies in order to understand the socio-economic implications of technological change, especially studies and innovations which minimize ecological disturbances are worth promoting, as well as studies on cheap building technology for building houses for the poor in the rural areas, and development of auxiliary agricultural activities, increased agricultural production and equal income distribution create a mass market and an effective demand for industrial products and services. Also, industrial products and services are necessary for rural development. To promote the overall development of rural areas, steps should be taken so that industries are established in the rural regions. Tax incentives, especially for small and medium industries, can be of much help in this regard. These measures will become more attractive for investors when more public institutions established in rural areas, especially household industries, offer numerous possibilities, e.g., in organizations of the cooperative industrial units. The government can promote their establishment by making funds available and by establishing vocational training institutes, providing relevant information, and supporting market networks. Rural work programs can offer the opportunity of earning additional income, for example, at the same time of developing infrastructure, especially during the periods when there is not much work in agriculture. Such measures should be integrated in the general development plans and be implemented with the people collaborating in the planning process. In some regions, there are areas that can be used to grow forests for achieving both ecological balances, as well as for providing fuel, wood, and fodder. Fisheries and aquaculture can also improve the income of small farmers. Education, training, and extension. School education is a fundamental need, not only for the development of a human being, but also for modernizing the rural economy. Free primary level education should be given top priority. Education is important for imparting knowledge that will finally help in increasing productivity and income of people. In order to achieve this goal in full measure, research and extension have to work simultaneously. Schools should be equipped with plots of agricultural land so that agricultural skills and knowledge can be acquired through research. Moreover, possibilities of training in the fields of nutrition, agriculture, farm management, and cooperative skills should be created, and knowledge and skills for taking up an occupation in a non-agricultural sector like construction work and repairing implements should also be imparted, with particular attention to using local material. Demand for in-service training of rural development professionals. The personnel from the government institutions at various levels should be given training on regular basis, particularly about the special requirements of rural development and the problems of the poor sections of the population. In the agrarian sector, there is a great demand for intermediary level extension workers, where people from the villages should be trained and sent back to these villages. Successful agricultural development requires collaboration between planners, rural educators, extension officers, and officials from the rural organizations to coordinate their activities. In particular, farmers should participate in the planning of research so that it complies with their specific needs. Q. Regional cooperation amongst developing countries. The developing countries should examine the possibilities of close cooperation among themselves in various fields of rural development, and the support of the industrial countries should also be sought from time to time. Flexible terms for allocation, the assumption of domestic currency costs and current expenses, the remission of debts and increases in food aid as compensation for temporary decreases in production during land reforms, are important steps in this regard. It is also to be ensured that food aid does not bring about a reduction in the efforts towards domestic production. 1.7 Summary. Land reform can be understood as the redistribution of property rights related to land for the benefit of the landless, tenants, and farm laborers. There are 4 basic approaches to study land reform, and these are: land for the tiller, in Asia and the Middle East, redistribution of estates, Latin America and Africa, redistribution of land, and finally decollectivization in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. There are 4 main types of interventions in land reform, namely, land tenure reform, external inducements, external controls, and conformation of title. Land reform has 2 main dimensions: redistributional land reform, aiming to minimize accumulation of land holding with a particular group or social institution, takes the shape of transfer of land assets from one group, either the state or, more often, large private landowners, to either landless or small producers. Institutional land reform is the second dimension, which focuses on the various areas of institutional support to land reform. The need for land reform is felt because of being an instrument of both direct and indirect poverty reduction, resulting in improved income for small farmers, increasing employment opportunities in the agricultural sector, and making available of farm credit for small rural producers. There are other reasons as well, such as increased agricultural incomes leading to increased demands for tradable commodities and manufactured goods, greater food security, protecting and strengthening the rights of indigenous small farmer groups, empowering women agricultural labor leading to greater gender equity, providing direct support to vulnerable groups, including the old, youth, and those affected by physical and mental disabilities, and encouraging the conservation and management of ecological balance, and preventing encroachment on common property resources such as forests and pastures. The importance of land reform can be understood in terms of enhanced agricultural assets leading to equality in land distribution and enhancing agriculture production. Enhanced production further provides allied employment for rural people and helps in reducing poverty. There are certain areas where we can visualize contributions of land reform for overall socio-economic development of the society are visible in the promotion of socio-economic equality in the rural population, enhancement in economic and political power in rural areas, improvement in the quality of life of rural population, and changing pattern in rural investment. There are still some gray areas which have to be stressed upon in order to make land reform a success in the developing society like India. These areas are enhanced agricultural production and food security, optimal utilization of rural workforce, socio-economic equality amongst rural population, genuine political commitment and the administrative foresight, adequate administrative capacity for land reform, access to land, water, and other resources. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.